Good morning to everyone, my colleagues in the United States and elsewhere in the world. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I'm Tony Jackson. I'm the Vice President for Education and Director of the Center for Global Education at Asia Society. And welcome to today's plenary panel, Equity in Chinese Language Education. The Center for Global Education at Asia Society has, for the past 2 decades, really, been focused on 2 intertwined issues in education. The first is the fact that the world has changed enormously in the past couple of generations. It's become more complex and more interconnected through technology as well as through massive migration. So education needs to change in response so that young people coming out of schools can thrive in this new global environment. So much of our work has been to redefine what excellence in education looks like, to include the thinking skills and the socio-emotional capacities that together we call global competence. And learning a language other than your home language is absolutely a part of global competence. And that's really driven our work over the past 15 years, really, to promote Chinese language learning. What's also animated our work over the past 2 decades is the older and deeper issue of inequities in outcomes and in the conditions of education for low-income and minority youth. We start with the assumption, not that poor children of color are failing in school at alarming rates, rather school systems are failing at alarming rates to provide learning opportunities sufficient to enable all youth to fulfill their full potential. So these 2 strands come together in our panel today: excellence redefined as global competence, and absolutely including Chinese and other language learning, and equity, a belief that we must change education to address the differentiated needs of each and every student, which means especially ensuring that children marginalized by poverty and by racism get what they need to succeed. We have a terrific panel of good friends to explore these issues, and I'll introduce all of them now and then ask them, well, actually, I guess I was going to say to wave their hands, but you have their names on the screen, so I won't need to do that. But let me just say a few words about each of them, and then we'll get right to our discussion. Let me start with Sue Park. Sue Park is the head of the Yuming Public Charter School, and Yuming is California's first Mandarin immersive charter school. Based in Oakland, California, Yuming provides an academically rigorous, innovative, and comprehensive Chinese-English bilingual education to K through 8 students from many racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic backgrounds. Yuming nurtures its inclusive and diverse community to become empowered and engaged and outstanding global citizens that use their education to make a positive difference in the world. Eddie Conger, a good friend, is Superintendent of International Leadership of Texas. I'm going to use Eddie's own words to introduce him as he would introduce himself to prospective IL teachers, IL parents, IL Texas parents. He says, after serving 20 years as a United States Marine Corps infantry officer and traveling to numerous countries throughout the world, I fully recognize the critical importance of ensuring our children receive the highest quality education that's humanly possible. And I know from experience that when students are held to high expectations, both academic excellence and appropriate civil behavior is entirely possible, and they will rise to that high standard. So at IL Texas, your child will be given an incredible opportunity to develop and model servant leadership and to master 3 languages: English, Spanish, and Chinese. Bonnie Wang is a Chinese teacher at the Durham Academy in North Carolina and is the co-founder of a really important organization called Courageous Dialogues with Chinese Educators. Bonnie Wang is an experienced Chinese teacher and strong education professional. She has an MA in linguistics from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And she's an active member and a conference presenter at ACTFL and a number of other language education conferences. Her current research focuses include incorporating social justice components in the proficiency-based world language curriculum, integrating technology, calligraphy, Chinese poetry, and film in Chinese language and culture classes. And last but certainly not least, by any stretch, is Zharong Zhao, also known as Amy. Zharong is a Chinese Sign Language teacher and international education director at Turquoise International Education School, a school for the deaf. And she's also a research scholar at St. Cloud University, where she focuses on research in Chinese Sign Language. So this is the way our panel will work. I'm going to discuss a number of questions with our colleagues, and hopefully really use those as a bit of a jumping off point for a general conversation about equity in Chinese language learning. We'll save some time for questions at the end, as we often do in these panels. But I want to encourage you in our audience to not wait until the end to post your questions, but to post them in the chat as they occur to you as we're going through our dialogue. Don't hold back, and I will actually try as best as possible to work some of those questions into our conversation. So let's begin, and let me begin with this question that I'll ask each of the panelists to respond to. It's a fundamental question. Why is it important for language educators to address inequality in education? Why should this be a part of your job description as a Chinese language educator? And let me turn first to Sue Park and see if you can help us with that question. Sue?
Thank you, Tony. Can you all hear me? Can you hear me, Tony?
Yeah.
Just want to make sure.
Perfect.
Okay, great.
Uh-huh.
I'm so honored and privileged to be here and to be engaging in this really important conversation. I think that question is really hard to consider without considering this particular moment that our country is experiencing, and we are all experiencing. Living here, it's really felt like an unrelenting season of tragedy and heartbreak, and even apart from, I think, what the tremendous losses that we've seen with COVID. We've seen a lot of racial violence, unnecessary loss of lives, even among children. I'm thinking right now specifically Adam Toledo in Chicago just this week, the mass shootings in Indianapolis, the racist murders in Atlanta, the alarming rise in anti-Asian violence and hate at all levels in our country, and the more than 100 Black men and boys that have been killed by police violence. And I really could continue, but I say all this to say that it has really felt like an unrelenting cycle of loss and tragedy. And many of us are feeling outraged and exhausted, and even in our communities, fear, and for our own well-being and those of our families and our neighbors. And I think that more and more we're realizing on a really human, visceral level, not just at an intellectual level, but that systemic racism is not just about economic inequality or the educational opportunity gap. It's really literally a matter of life or death in this moment for all of us. And I think that we're realizing that we cannot stand by as citizens or as educators. But I see in our role a tremendous opportunity to create the classrooms and schools that our students really deserve. And especially, you mentioned, Tony, the power of our global languages and global citizenship, and understanding how developing that awareness among our students really creates the kind of relationships and culture and understanding and bridge building that will really be the solution, I think, in saving our country, and also creating the economic and educational opportunities that we're all currently and continue to work to create for our students. So, yeah, I'm really excited for this conversation and to be engaging in it, not only with our panelists, but all of our incredible educators that hold children across our country, and especially in this moment.
Thanks, Sue. And let me just turn to Eddie just a second, but I just want to follow real quickly. Do you think, Sue, that things have gotten worse in the last 6 months, year, or is this just a continuation of things as usual in our country?
What I think, I think the latter. I think our country, if we really look at the history and the way the education system was founded, it really was founded as a structure of inequity and benefiting some and not others. It was actually written into our laws who could and who couldn't get an education. We also know the history of multilingual education. There were, laws barring us from holding on to our own language or accessing language learning in schools. So it's a part of our history. It's a part of the water we swim in the United States. But I think what is changing is that there has been more of a moral reckoning and a wider understanding of the role that we all play and how complicit we are in either contributing to ongoing inequities or disrupting those inequities. And so I think more and more of us are waking up to that realization and asking ourselves, what role can I play to make a change? Excellent.
Very good. Yes. I think that's a very good point about everybody's getting woke in a way. Mm-hmm. Eddie, let me turn to you. Why is it so important for us to address inequity as part of what we do as educators, and particularly in Chinese language learning? Eddie, can you hear me?
Right. Well, as Sue mentioned, there has been so much. Yes, there's been so much hate over this last year that has been, to say it's challenging is a understatement. Our charter of nearly 21,000 students is a very, very diverse charter. Our staff is very, very diverse. And we, from the very beginning, tried to attack this head on. And by providing a very safe place so that everyone would be able to communicate from students within themselves, our staff, also with our parents. We have come out in a very strong statement 6 days after murdered. We continue to have a strong statement with the attacks on the Asian American community. And there's a lot of fear that is out there, and rightful fear. But as an educator, with more than half of our students that are students of color, it's just been very, very important for us to keep focused on what we're doing of servant leadership, others before ourselves, respect, and then learning the languages. 60+% of our students are low socioeconomic. And so we have invested to have every kid have not only the device at home, but also the internet access at home. And then to celebrate the different cultures. We're richer and better off the more that we can celebrate each other's cultures and make sure that looking out for our brothers and sisters.
Thank you, Eddie. And let me just pose to you, I mean, I don't mean to be political, but I will, because I get there sometimes. Does that message that you're sending resonate well in Texas, or is there a different sentiment happening there that you have to sort of reckon with as well, that makes it sometimes maybe a little difficult to bring that message forward? I'm just curious.
No, that's a great question, Tony. And sometimes I feel like I'm right in the middle. But the message overwhelmingly, has been received positive. But each time I do send out a heavy message, I do have some folks who push back. But what we're trying to do is to help both sides. And some of my friends that are on the right, helping them to pause a minute and to be able to think through what someone else has really gone through. And I think that piece of it is very important. We this Brian Hines, who has worked with us as an organization. I've also created advisory committee and really engage the kids and the parents in some of these conversations. But my personal, since you said you didn't really want to go there, but on a personal note, is there is fear, I think, in everybody's mind. And some of the folks that may be on the right, they have fear, but from my perspective, there shouldn't be fear. And so we're working hard to help work through that.
You mentioned something, Eddie, that I think is really critical, and it's certainly a huge part of what we consider to be global competence, and that is what we would say is being able to recognize and weigh other people's perspectives, to be able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. And I do think that that's really essential, just as Sue was saying, around raising awareness and understanding each other's cultures, to really be able to try on another culture, at least and to view things from a different perspective. So I'm really happy to hear that you're trying to do that. Bonnie, let me turn to you. Why is it important for language educators to address inequality in education?
Yes, so like what our other panelists already said, under the bigger umbrella of teaching global citizens, I think addressing inequality in our education is a part of our responsibilities. And I am speaking on behalf of a frontline teacher in the classroom. And it seems that since last year, we are in this more emergent push and more immediate motivation to promote courageous conversations in our school and classroom. But it's really just like discrimination, structural inequality always exists in our society and, of course, in our education field. When we're looking at some of the research data, that the recent US Census shows only 20% of Americans can converse in 2 or more languages, compared with 56% of Europeans. And when we found that the troubling low rates of Black and Brown students' participation and advancement, and even reduced presence in higher level world language classes when compared with other minoritized counterparts and white students, and also there's a lack of AAPI educators to represent our rising AAPI student body. Like when we're looking at those data, we ask questions about why and where those unheard voices are.
That's not going to work. I'll interpret.
And thank you for interpreting, Amy. I think we need to address the inequality because our roles matter and because our world language education matters. We teach world language and world culture together to ensure students have more than one-sided understanding on any issues. The world language and culture education establishes the thinking, philosophy, and habit for our students to understand their role in the globalized world and to calibrate their relationship between themselves, their own cultures, and other cultures. And ultimately, we want them to evaluate issues more objectively and independently. And one of my favorite books that I recently have reread it again and again, Words and Actions by Cassandra Glynn,
You got it?
Pamela Wesley, and Beth Wessel. The 3 authors wrote that the world language classroom is uniquely suited to challenge, confront, and disrupt misconceptions and truths and stereotypes that lead to structural inequality and discrimination based on social and human differences. And I think when we are repeating those words to ourselves, the world language educators, our experiences and our students' lives are essentially impacted by the reality filled with values and judgments that are systematically formed. And therefore, it is essential, it's so critical for us to address the inequality in our classroom.
Absolutely, yeah. That's excellent. And then let me turn to Zhirong. And Zhirong, let me just ask you to respond generally to that question, but then also maybe what are some specific equity accessibility issues to deaf students that deaf students face particularly? And I'll actually ask you to maybe say a little bit more about how these may have changed, particularly during COVID, because I want to ask the whole panel a little bit about things, some concrete examples of what's happened during COVID in a second. But let me start with you. What are some specific equity accessibility issues for deaf students or others in special education systems that students face that reflect some inequities within our system?
Yes. Let me just say that there are significant limitations for students focusing on sign language, both coming from a cultural perspective as well as a linguistic perspective. But with deaf students, and it doesn't matter where they're from, whether they be Chinese, American, or any country for that matter, they need more access to foreign languages. And so with the in order to increase their global competencies and their ability to communicate. So by increasing their world knowledge and a variety of cultures, their world perspective will broaden for them and open up. So with deaf students and with hearing students, I mean, they function the same way. Their brains function the same way. The only difference is that deaf students are unable to hear. They're doing this in a world without sound. So with hearing students, hearing things linguistically coming out of the mouth, as opposed to with deaf students receiving things coming off of hands and sign language, deaf and hearing students are the same linguistically in terms of how they receive that language. So again, for deaf students, it's imperative that they have access to more than one language. So we, for deaf students, have set up Chinese Sign Language curriculums. Again, because that being the key to open up their global competencies and their linguistic abilities.
Let me just ask a basic question to Shirong. Do most languages have a sign version of those languages? If they were made available, do they exist that they could possibly become available to more deaf students? Obviously in Chinese and English, but is it broadly that languages have a sign component?
Yeah. So each country has their own sign language. So like here in America, we have American Sign Language. Chinese has spoken Chinese and Chinese Sign Language. But, you know, all languages, many languages, have an equivalent sign language. The difference in sign language and spoken language, though, is the facial grammar and the non-manual components of the language. But yes, to answer your question.
Yeah, it's a basic question, but I must admit this is something that I know about. So I want to ask those questions that really help me understand, and hopefully our audience as well. Let me just turn then to first think a little bit about some concrete examples, particularly during COVID, of where you've seen inequities happen in your schools and your system, but maybe also to you as an individual educator. We'll get to some solutions in just a second, but I'm just curious about how this has had a sort of played out in your own situations. And let me start with you, Bonnie. How have you personally, or what you've seen around inequities during the pandemic?
Yes, thank you, Tony. That is a good question because they are always there. Most of the inequalities, they already existed, and I think the remote or hybrid learning since starting COVID just brought in newer challenges to the families who have limited internet access, food security, and parent assistantship with the learning at home, and also limited resources of learning differences and much more. We have students who cannot come back in person after our school has decided to bring back everybody in person in May. And that is not only about the COVID safety issue, it's also about their own, they have lost trust in the school and society after the rising anti-Asian and anti-API hate crimes and violence. And I've heard that from our Asian American families. I've heard them telling me that, and I've heard students also express their concern. And I think that's not only happening in our school, that happens nationwide. There has been report, there has been survey by the U.S. Department of Education that they published the survey in late March, and they reviewed that 15% of Asian American students were attending school in person full time in January, which is compared with 49% of white students, 33% of Latino students, and 28% of Black students, because they're worried about being bullied and harassed by their peers or just random people on the street. And I think in addition to this fear or worries coming back in person, when students they are learning at home or learning remotely or hybridly, there's a big shift of the neurodivergent students' needs and also the socioeconomic disparities, as well as the racial inequality. And all of those have already existed, but they have been magnified through their school experience during pandemic.
Interesting. Yeah. Let me turn to either Sue, Eddie, or Zhang. Do you want to come in on this? What have you experienced that's particular to the pandemic and within your school? What have you seen that sort of brings us home?
Sue? Yes. So, in addition to just the sad and disturbing data that Bonnie shared about who is accessing learning right now, I want to bring an example locally from the Bay Area. There was a news report, a news survey done with all of our largest Bay Area districts back, I think it was February. And in that survey, it found that 100% of the school districts in the Bay Area that had a median household income of at least $200,000 had in-person instruction. Only 12% of districts with median incomes of $100,000 or less were in in-person instruction. So that is an opportunity gap like no other when we know that we are losing students in the virtual world right now. If they're not in school, we can't be 100% certain that they're making the learning gains, right, that they need to make this year. And so I think for me also, I agree with Bonnie that this is not just a access and equity question in COVID. It predated COVID. And I would love to just, ask our field, my esteemed colleagues in the Chinese learning world, if we know that the tremendous, social currency and economic currency provided by being multilingual, and we know the cognitive benefits and academic benefits and social emotional benefits of being bilingual, especially in a difficult world language for English speakers like Chinese. How are we as a field making that resource, that door opening opportunity accessible to all? Is it just the purview of those that can pay tuition or those that were able to live in a zone or a district in which that kind of opportunity was provided? I mean, UMing is not only the first Mandarin immersion public charter school in California, we remain in the Bay Area the only Mandarin immersion school option that is not restricted by tuition or district of residence. And our wait lists always far exceed our enrollment. And I think that says something about the demand, the hunger for high quality, future creating educational opportunities. And I would really love our field to consider that question. How are we creating more access and opportunity?
That's a great question. I'll let Eddie pick up on that question if you'd like,
And I agree with. Yeah. Yes, I agree with. Yes, I agree with Bonnie. We were able to get a device in every student's hand. We were able to continue learning within 5 days back in March. We did it online for the spring. But starting in August, we also had all of our students could come back on campus and have live instruction. We wound up having about 40% of our students that decided and families decided face-to-face instruction was best for them. It probably was a higher percentage of our lower socioeconomic students that did come on campus because they were limited with either one parent at home or both parents having to work. But our students we were in a safe place for this entire school year that our kids were able to come to. But all of the kids were learning English, Spanish, and Chinese. So for our system of 21,000 kids, there was minimum breakup or disruption of their learning. The local districts, school districts in Houston and in Dallas, their enrollment dropped by over 5%. And those children have just dropped out of the system. In our system, because we were able to have the face-to-face, we increased by 8%. But I agree 100%. Educators in every system that we have got to continue to provide opportunities for more students to be able to come and be part of learning world languages.
Yeah. I mean, we're kind of asking, Sue and Eddie, you're picking up on a kind of an advocacy question. What is the, in effect, how is it going to change? I mean, we do have these pockets in our schools that we work with in Asian Society, are pockets of excellence around language learning, Chinese language learning, but going to scale is difficult. What's the barrier? What's keeping? I mean, maybe it's just we're preaching to the choir, and it's self-evident of how important this resource is, but it isn't, and the demand is there, as you said. But taking it broadly to scale, having Chinese language available everywhere is a difficult proposition. It seems. What's pushing back against that, and how do we, as a field, begin to really demand or do whatever is necessary to make it much more widely available? Anybody can come in, but I'll ask Sue about that question. You raised the question, so I'll ask you to maybe sort us off. Yeah.
Tony, I think.
Okay, so hold on, Eddie, go ahead.
I was just saying that I spent 10 years in the traditional education. I think traditional education, there's so much focused on the state test, the accountability from the federal government, the accountability of just reading and math, that they lose sight of what's really, really important. They get focused on what is urgent, and urgent is making sure that the state is off of the traditional ISDs or school systems back. And they get caught up there that they sometimes lose sight of that important piece. So for advocacy, if there was a way that we could work at the state level and at the district level of being able to emphasize how important it is for the world, but for our country, for our students to be multicultural, global focused, and speak multiple languages.
Great. Sue, did you want to come in, or Bonnie or Jerong on this question?
Just to add, I believe that
let me go to Sue first, and then Jerong, I'll come to you.
There has to be a tangible. Yeah.
Go ahead, Sue.
I think there has to be tangible policies that are instituted to be able to create access and equity. Just in my local example with Yuming, it was founded 10 years ago by families that really believe that our school should represent the rich diversity of our region. But they didn't get to the numeric diversity that they sought. And so what we did was we actually created categorical preferences for historically underserved students. And so about 4 years ago, we created a admission preference so that we set aside the first 20% of our open seats for families that qualify for free introduced lunch. We also changed our model from a two-way immersion program to a one-way immersion, kept our full immersion program, but in that sense, we were not saving half our seats for fully Mandarin fluent kids, because what we found was that while we continued to have 30% of our students with heritage language of Mandarin at home, a lot of the rest of those seats were being filled by families that could afford Mandarin preschool because there was no free preschool in our area. So what we decided to do was create a one-way immersion, dual language, setting aside 20% of our seats. And recently we were able to expand that preference to 30%, also double the number of kindergartners we'll be accepting in the fall. I think, and I believe we are still the only high-performing public school that has created that kind of intentional integration policy move. And I think, Oakland is one of the most diverse cities in the country, and it is one of the most segregated by economic and by educational opportunity and where students live. And so I think if we don't take proactive actions like that, we can't even begin to do the great work of, once we have an intentionally diverse school, of thinking about how do we create affirming environments with curricula that are reflective and culturally responsive. Like, we need to be able to get the numbers of diversity up and integration up, and then we can start thinking about the really important pedagogical questions as well, and inclusion questions. But I think it has to begin with policy.
Yeah. Shirong, did you want to come in on this?
I did. Yeah, and so for my teaching experience, masks have been a huge impediment. Using Zoom has been a huge impediment.
Yeah, I can see that.
Technology, just in general. And let me show you. You put a mask over my face, you're only getting maybe half of what's being said, because sign language is an all-inclusive language, including hands and face. And so then when you're online, we have students wearing masks, signing. Children are not able to learn that way. They're missing so much information. Again, with using a Zoom technology, the percentage of what they're learning just continues to go down. For deaf students, and the language that they use, it's very visual. The grammar, most of the grammar is on the face. So when I'm signing one-on-one with a student who's wearing a mask and I'm wearing a mask, we've got a disconnect there. And two, using Zoom, we oftentimes, we see internet connectivity being a problem. Messages being lost. Squares being extremely small makes it extremely hard to read and to see sign language. Body language as well. We use our body. And so we've got hands going at a screen. When we're in a 3D situation where we use a lot of signing space, when we are on a Zoom situation, we lose a lot of that because we're confined to a very small signing space. So again, talking about students coming from low socioeconomic families who maybe don't have access to Wi-Fi, or very poor Wi-Fi, or they don't even have laptops. They're using an iPad or an old phone. You're using it, these kids are using old iPhones that, again, restricts their ability to see, and for us to be able to see them as well.
Interesting. Great, thank you so much. So I think I think in a lot of ways we've touched on kind of what are some of the problems endemic to education broadly and policy perspective, but also the specifics of what's happening in individual classrooms or the situation that you're facing within the pandemic. Let's then now turn to some ideas of how do we actually address issues of equality and inequality in Chinese language learning. And one of the questions that's sort of related to this from the audience is I got it. Well, essentially, it was not only let's talk about what are the specific kinds of strategies and techniques you can use to infuse a greater sense of equity within Chinese language learning, but how do you actually help teachers do that when, in effect, they feel as though they're swimming upstream, that there's a sense that they're having to go outside of the normal curriculum, or in some way add this in an almost surreptitious way. So how do you both? What are the techniques? What are the strategies? And how do you also address the sense that it's unusual to have to do this, and how do you address these forces that play against trying to work on issues of equity in the Chinese language learning? Bonnie, let me start with you there. Let's hear from you.
Yes, sure. I agree with you. I think addressing the issues and applying to the strategies and using the resources, they have to be intentional, and but they also have to be baked into our curriculum and in our daily practices, because we know that equity is not a one-time action. It's not a one-step thing. It's also not even like a check box. It's a holistic, ongoing process, a dynamic process that involves mindset, skill sets, and also it should be included in our classroom expectations and daily procedures. It's not what we like. It's not what the teachers feel comfortable to talk. It's not what we want or what we feel good or cool or fun to teach, but it's what it is relevant to our students. And if anything that is relevant to them, if anything that they care, that's something that we should focus on. And our students, the Generation Z, the Gen Z people, they really care about what is going on in their life. They are on their social media more often than I have been. And there are many conversations, there are many moments in my classroom that the conversations were brought up by them before I even start to talk in class. So I think really building this culturally relevant, responsive, and sustainable pedagogy, it has to be coming back to the student center, knowing your student and understand who they are and provide targeted support, especially when we're looking at students of color. We're also looking at our queer students, our white students, our students from all different backgrounds in terms of their socioeconomic status and we have more and more students who are struggling with learning differences nowadays in terms of using technology and focusing, and also the managing their organizational skills and learning skills. And I think after we know them, either in informal or in the formal conversations, we need to keep checking our assumptions. We need to keep checking what they need. And that also needs to be going into our daily communications with students. And I think a lot of times the discussion came into our world language classes. We, as the world language teachers, we always want to say, like, oh, let's talk about this issue in a target language. But a lot of those topics could be very personal, and it can't be, like, student cannot use their target language to talk. So if that's the case, we can open the opportunities for them to share in person with teachers one-on-one in their native language. And we can accommodate a range of responses, and we can accommodate a range of their lived experiences just based on what they want to share. And just by saying that, I just realized there's a blind spot. I know there are many teachers in front of the camera right now, and if you're like, oh, like we never had those conversations since last year or even before that, ask yourself why those conversations weren't happen in your class, why students won't feel comfortable coming to our class and talk to you about their struggles or their opinions on some issues. And I think recognize that we all have biases, and tell students that even I'm a teacher, I'm also learning from you guys. I'm also learning from news. I'm also learning every day, and we are learning from each other every day. And no one is perfect in knowing every diverse community's perceptions or experiences. One other perspective that we can think about the strategies in addition to knowing your student is to, as educators, we need to model equity in our classroom. And to model equity, we need to first address the social injustice issues. Something happened in Atlanta, something happened in the US Capitol. We need to address them in our classroom. And it doesn't matter if you have the constituent in your class or not. You don't have to have students of color enrolled in your classes in order to address racial injustice. You don't have to have queer students enrolled in a specific class in order to address the gender inequality. I have my teacher friends asking me the question like, oh, like you are creating those slides with black and brown students, black and brown people's figure in the slides. Do you have black students in every class? And I will say, it doesn't matter. You're modeling the equity and inclusion to every student, and they can see how an educator, how their teacher is doing, is treating, is respecting the society every day. And also, like when something happened in the textbook that we think this is problematic, we need to examine and we need to address the problems. Sometimes some online open learning platforms, they may not have enough supervision or moderator to ensure all the materials that are open to students to learn is appropriate. When that happened, when we observe, when students reported to us, we need to include everybody and then have a discussion. That's a really, really good teachable moment. And think about like, do the characters in our textbook really reflect our student body? I remember I've used some textbook before that every Asian figure in the textbook, they are not American. All the Asian face in the textbook, they are either from Asia or they're international scholars or international students. And like if we're using the textbook not addressing the problems, how can we look into our Asian American students' eyes and then tell them that we believe in you, we stand by you, like we are here with you, we love you. We can't. There's no enough core to support me saying that. And if we do see problems, can we supplement by adding additional diverse communities conversations or diverse conversations to the instructional materials? And I think we can. And sometimes it doesn't have to be like we have to be expert in recognizing all the problems. If we can create a classroom with equity and inclusion, students will come to talk to you. Students will ask the questions, and they're always more sensitive than we are.
Yeah. So that's wonderful. I mean, you're really saying that in your students' lives, no matter who they are, these issues of inequity and racism and bias are in the air, and they're concerned with them. And why not use those as teachable moments in the target language or not? But I mean, let's make the classroom a relevant place in so many ways, and to use, as you said, the curriculum materials as both helpful but also problematic at times, and not shy away from raising those issues. That's really, really important. Eddie, I'm assuming you're there. We're seeing a screen, but I wanted to just turn to you, if I can, to get your take on kind of what are some of the strategies and resources that you've employed to increase equity in Chinese language classrooms and programs.
Again, it's hard to answer that question because every one of our students at IL Texas, every student is in our Chinese program. If the students are at IL Texas, they don't have an option not to be there. But I mean, they don't have an option not to be in a Chinese program and learning Chinese, the culture and a little bit of the history, the songs. But I do agree with Bonnie. One of the things that we have to do as a education system is recognize that when the kids come to our schools, if the school or the teachers and the administrators and counselors are not helping the kids talk about those issues that are outside the classroom, then we're doing a disservice to our children, because they are reacting to the George Floyd issue. They're reacting to the increase crimes, microaggressions, and physical aggression with our Asian American community. So as an organization, we have to be very, very deliberate in finding safe places that we're allowing the students to talk, and that we're encouraging them to speak out and speak up, and that they're not alone. And I think that piece of it there is what's so very, very important. We held a Zoom evening time with the superintendent for all 112 of our Chinese teachers. And it was very enlightening, in some ways encouraging, but at the same time, for me as a Texan, and you mentioned politics there, it was disappointing to have to hear some of the comments that our teachers have received out in the community. But by giving support to our teachers and giving support to our students, I think that encouragement is something that will help empower them even more.
Great. We have time for just a quick answer from both Zhirong and Sue. And Zhirong, I'm going to come to you and then to Sue to finish. But Zhirong, in one of the questions from the audience that relates to this is how could you share how teachers can include the deaf community in Chinese curriculum? In other words, how can Chinese Sign Language be incorporated within Chinese language teaching broadly as a means to address equity issues and broaden the curriculum? Can you speak to that?
Yeah. As far as Chinese Sign Language in curriculum, yeah, in an effort to make those inequities less, we can certainly make accommodations there. So there are a lot of Chinese language teachers out there who don't know anything about Chinese Sign Language. With deaf students, it's different. I mean, when we're talking about deaf students and deaf teachers, it's different there. Mm-hmm. So with American students, studying Chinese culture and Chinese Sign Language and putting those together and exposing students and teachers to that certainly can increase those global competencies and close those gaps, those inequities.
Thank you so much. Sue, I'm going to let you have the last word. Just on this issue of specifics around how do you actually address inequity in Chinese language learning?
I completely agreed with my panelists, Bonnie, Eddie, and Xiaorong, in talking about how the safe containers and opportunity for students need to be created to have these courageous conversations, to access those conversations, and also to see in the curriculum themselves reflected and affirmed. But I also believe we really need to recognize that our teachers in our Chinese language classrooms have actually not had the opportunity themselves to have these courageous conversations and explore their identity and actually have an understanding, a deep understanding about the historical realities of how our systems have been created here. And I think many of them come to us. They are first-gen immigrants, and they have been, benefiting from a different education system. And so when they come to the U.S., they are expected to receive children when they don't know the U.S. histories, these students' histories, the history of immigration, and all the ways that our educational system has been structured. And so what I think needs to happen is we as leaders and systems leaders need to really think about how do we fill sort of knowledge gaps, and then also recognize the strengths of connection of our Chinese teachers. Where have they experienced privilege and also oppression themselves, and how can their identity development be fostered and nurtured, and then make a connection to what is happening in the United States? And so I think we need to deepen our educator professional learning around this area so that they feel better equipped to hold our student conversations and learning.
Excellent. That's a really, really important point to make and to end on. This has been a fabulous panel. I mean, really, really insightful, and thank you for your thinking about this. Excuse me. I think we have run out of time, unfortunately, though. We could go on for such a long time on these issues, but I do again want to thank all of you for coming here this morning, this afternoon, for you and participating. And I think this is the last plenary for the Chinese Language Conference, but it goes on. And so for my audience, I'll just wish you a good morning and also to enjoy the rest of the conference. So with that, thanks very much and goodbye.